by later in his life was universally respected. I mean, he was the person that Congress chose to give the official eulogy before Congress for Andrew Jackson when he died, for Abraham Lincoln when he died, who was feted and would host parties at his Washington townhouse for presidents regardless of party and kings. And he was the one person that the U.S. Senate gave permission to could attend and go onto the Senate floor at any time and sit up at the main podium. I mean, he was a towering statesman-like figure, in part because of his histories. But what he'd started with was a New England upbringing. He was the son of a congregational minister. He attended Phillips Exeter and Harvard. And then he was sent to Europe as a young man by Harvard's president, Kirkland, who wanted his would-be future professors to earn something new, the doctorate degree, because the only place you could earn a doctorate then was in the universities of Germany, which had created these first real, what we would recognize as research universities. And so he was sent as a 17-year-old to Europe, where he earned his PhD, but he traveled around and sort of like a weird Forrest Gump figure, encountered and hung out with almost everybody. Lord Byron and Washington Irving and Marquis de Lafayette and, Herring, studying literally under Hegel and Herring while they were coming up with the theories of German nationhood and European nationhood. And then he came back to the United States, his head full of these ideas about nations being organic entities that grow from a seed and, inevitably develop according to the instructions within them, like a plant or something. He molded that with his Puritan New England upbringing that said, we Puritans are, chosen by God, a covenanted people tasked with an errand in the wilderness, put a light on a hill and create a more godly society. He said that Americans were tasked by God to carry human freedom forward for humanity, and based on the ideals in the Declaration of Independence, and that is our seed, so to speak, that we will grow from, and it's inevitable, and that American exceptionalism and destiny are all rolled up in this. And that's where, he wrote in his histories that, God was sort of present while the founders were writing the Constitution. All of that stuff, that strange mythology around our nationhood originally gets packaged by Bancroft, and in part because of his own life and background, that it's packaged the way it is.
All right. Well, sounds like a very optimistic take, and I can see why people embrace it for a very long time. Not the one that others universally accept. There are competing theses on what America is. Tell me about William Gilmore Simms. Sounds like a darker take on it, although in his mind it would not be a darker take, I would imagine. So what is his thesis, and in what context does it find purchase?
Yeah, so Simms is Bancroft's contemporary, and like Bancroft, he's forgotten today, but he was the antebellum South's and the Confederacy's leading man of letters. He was a best-selling novelist, popular across the United States, and he had a very different set of experiences. He'd grown up in Charleston, and his father had left his mother early on and moved to the wild and frontier, the rough southern frontier in Mississippi and Alabama. Had served under a man named Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. And his mother had been more tied to Charleston and those social circles. And Simms was always torn between the two, but traveled with his father throughout the southern frontier and understood the South in great detail. And his belief was that Jefferson was wrong. The Declaration of Independence was completely and self-evidently wrong, that men and humans are not created equal and don't have inalienable rights, that only certain races, which at a time was a combination of ethnographies and races, only certain races were capable of self-government and democracy, and that the Anglo-Saxon race, the allegedly superior Anglo-Saxon race, was the one destined to rule here, and that the only one that the Declaration applied to, that we were an ethno-state, the homeland of these Anglo-Saxon race, that the United States was really a federation and alliance of organic nations like South Carolina and Massachusetts, which shared in common this Anglo-Saxon, triumph and legacy. And so there was a very different and contradictory vision of what the United States should be, one that he, of course, embraced, especially once he married well and became a a slave plantation owner himself, like he'd always wanted to be. And he carried out this combat with Bancroft and Bancroft's allies, which provided the ammunition that sort of drove us towards the Civil War, the ammunition between these two competing philosophies that would bring the country to brinksmanship.
And this would be found, for example, with those in the Know Nothing Party in Massachusetts that have anti-Irish legislation. Would they be aware of William Gilmore Simms, or is it more of a coincidence that they're pushing forth legislation like this?
I think anyone who was in the reading public at all, who was reading the speeches, the way that ideas were disseminated and fought over back then were either in speeches or book form, especially speeches because the speeches would be made into books, or newspapers would publish the text of a speech that had just been given, and then other newspapers, as soon as they got a copy, would publish it themselves. They would retweet it, so to speak, and that's how things would spread. And then other people would respond to the speech with their own speech, taking it on. So you'd have this sort of Twitter-like conversation occurring in analog form at a slightly slower pace, but with just as many retweets and replies and arguments, and that was where it all happened. And anyone who was paying attention to that conversation would have been well aware of Simms and his allies' arguments and points of view, and it had to either directly or indirectly have shaped some of their own arguments and thoughts as they move forward. Because if the country is only to belong to a subset of its people who are worthy of practicing democracy, that has all kinds of implications and could be used by all kinds of forces in their local conditions and against people they didn't like in their local environments.
Well, these two ideas will be carried forth in the future, but they're not going to go without modification. But before we jump into the 20th century, we definitely need to look at Frederick Douglass, and his views are heavily contested today. There's last 4th of July, Colin Kaepernick quotes part of one of his speeches, and then others are saying that he's misinterpreting what Frederick Douglass is saying. But let's see what the man himself said. So what did Frederick Douglass say?
Well, he's a pivotal figure in this story of nationhood because, Bancroft may have come up with this civic national vision, but because he believed that it was a God had set forth this plan and that it was unfolding according to its instructions, he was very complacent. He didn't believe that anybody needed to push or modify events. Just wait patiently and everything will unfold as it should. And nothing would shake him from this belief. Not even the Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction would shake him from the belief that America was, heading along in its course and don't worry about these things. And he wasn't personally all that interested in the plight of African Americans and others who didn't belong. He ignored Frederick Douglass's existence his entire life, which is a very hard thing to do, particularly when you're ambassador to the United Kingdom at the time that Frederick Douglass is becoming an international celebrity, touring to massive audiences around England, talking about the very themes of your own book, but he just pretended that Douglass didn't exist. But Douglass is important because he took that civic national tradition and said, no, Americans, you have not achieved any of these ideals. You failed in them. My experiences can show it firsthand, and I will describe them to you, that you must finally achieve the ideals that we set out in the Declaration of Independence to achieve, and pointing out the hypocrisies when we did not. And he ended up using his considerable influence and profile and celebrity to not only write speeches and books, but also to go to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War multiple times to influence him, and pushing him towards decisions like to issue the Gettysburg Address, where he essentially says the purpose of the war is to achieve these yet unachieved ideals in the Declaration of Independence. Those were big deal moments. And of course, Lincoln was killed shortly after the war ended, but Frederick Douglass lived right in through the late 19th century and, was one of these lone voices on it with a big stage, decrying what was happening during Reconstruction and the rolling back of the sort of winning by the South and by the Confederates of the peace. So he was an enormously important figure, and the speeches he produced talking about America's purpose and story and ideals are some of the best articulations of the civic national vision that we have.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
I recommend for listeners to follow up, read the speech, in addition to your book, of course, Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, where he expounds that one point he says, "What to American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim." But then he says later that the Constitution is a glorious liberty document and is arguing against secessionists that the ideas of slavery aren't found in the Constitution, but America needs to live up to the ideals. So there's a lot more to get into there. But let's go into later on in the 20th century as these ideas are continually contested. Tell me about the frontier thesis, because I think you can say there's still echoes. I wouldn't say in scholarship, but in a lot of popular history of America, this idea. Like Teddy Roosevelt believed it heart and soul, and other people did in the 20th century. So what was the frontier thesis?
Yeah, it had an influence for half a century that was overwhelming and remains with us in popular culture and movies and novels. And it was the argument put forward by a young professor named Frederick Jackson Turner, who had grown up in western Wisconsin and had attended school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and had a very different regional perspective than many of the other participants in the national conversation who'd been from the older, settled East Coast. And his argument was that what made Americans Americans wasn't any of that stuff in the colonial period. Americans became Americans when the settlers crossed the Appalachian Mountains into what's now the Midwest and the West, and separated by geography and everything else from the old world, from the legacy of Europe on the East Coast, essentially separated from history. They had re-entered what Turner imagined to be a sort of Garden of Eden, where they could revert to their true form as good Republicans and freedom-loving individuals, that the experience of the frontier leveled society and stripped away all the feudal accretions and subtexts of society, and that people were egalitarian and by necessity created self-government and watched out for each other, and that's what made the American character. And this was, in essence, taking Bancroft's thesis and swapping out God and God tasking things for Darwin. Turner was a child during the Civil War and was at his maturity as a scholar at the turn of the 20th century. And in that later age, science and scientific reasoning had become the rage, and in the era of Bancroft, less so. And so he'd argued that Darwinian evolution, environmental adaptation, was what shaped Americans, not God, but rather you arrived in this physical environment and you, like any other organism, adapted to that environment. Now, the problem was that shortly after he issued his essay on the frontier thesis, which kind of went viral, so to speak, and was embraced throughout the country and had a life of its own, and soon everyone was talking about it and was getting inserted into the way universities taught history and into textbooks that 3 generations of Americans would learn their American history from, and into films and everything else. But shortly after he issued that thesis, Turner himself, who was a procrastinator as a writer but absolutely loved research, he just started diving deeper into his research and realized that thesis didn't actually work, that the data wasn't showing it. He was getting out, using the new sciences of cartography and federal data collection. He was expecting to see that as settlers crossed over into the Appalachians, into this new environment, that they would become more like each other and all become, freedom-loving egalitarians. And yet what he found instead is that settlers from the different settlement streams, the ones coming out of New England and across upstate New York and into the upper Great Lakes states, or the ones coming from Pennsylvania and circulating through the upper parts of the lower Great Lakes states, or the Appalachian settlers coming and settling the lower parts of Indiana and Ohio and Illinois and so on, that they actually retained their characteristics and had very distinct behaviors that seemed to persist. He was frustrated by this because he thought it would be environmental determinism, but I guess what he was groping towards, and he spent the last 2-3 decades of his life trying to write his new magnum opus on America and its sections. It would have been a book that might have been similar to my own American Nations, although I didn't know about his work when I was writing that book back a decade ago. And that he was frustrated because nobody wanted to hear his new work. It was like being a rock band that had had a number 1 hit smash single, and then when they go on concert tour, nobody wants to hear any stuff from the new album. They just want to hear the old one, right? He couldn't get anyone to pay him more than polite attention to his argument that, no, it's the sections that mattered and have shaped our history. But in a sense, it was too late. His ideas took a life of their own, beyond even what the author of the idea came to think himself.
And as an aside, in Hollywood movies, the most popular genre for probably from World War II up to the 60s and 70s were Westerns. And